This is The Micro Effect. The Micro Effect. www.themicroeffect.com.
You take the blue pill. The story ends. You wake up in your bed and believe whatever you want to believe. You take the red pill. You stay in Wonderland. And I show you how deep the rabbit hole goes.
There was a mighty nation, blessed above all of creation. It was a rare and precious pearl, conceived in faith and liberty, home of the brave, land of the free. It was the envy of the world. But this shining city on a hill has turned from the Creator's will and let evil take control. Now the reckless men who lead them want to strip away their freedom and to steal their very soul. Now it's smoke and mirrors, switching bait, criticize and confiscate and let the guilty walk away. In this once righteous, godly nation, in the halls of education, they forbid a child to pray. They say we need to spread the wealth. They pretend to guard the health of the feeble and the poor, while the hand they hold behind their backs confuses and conceals the fact that the wolf is at the door. There's an unseen hand that pulls the string. It makes his little puppets dance to every... On a rising tide, look beyond the shadows, behold a pale horse rise. They claim to seek a new world order.
Well, welcome to Connecting the Dots with Dan Happel. It's a beautiful Tuesday morning here, and we really have a special show in mind. I want to thank our listeners for joining us this morning, and I want to thank our two guests for joining us. We have Mr. John McManus and we have Mr. William Jasper on the call this morning, and we are going to be finishing the discussion that we started last week on the deep state and the New World Order. And it was such a terrific call last week. I had a number of people contact me and say, will you please amplify a little bit on some of the stuff that was talked about, and can we continue on the discussion of the deep state the way it is happening right now in the United States of America. And certainly both of these gentlemen really understand this subject, and I think what we really want to do today is show how all the things that we talked about last week, the history of the New World Order and all the things that have led up to what has been created in the deep state, and that is literally an out-of-control bureaucracy, and it's filled with people who have nothing but contempt for our constitutional Republican government. And these people are now in charge of much of our government, and it's a frightening thought, but we've allowed it to happen because of our complacency. And the John Birch Society has been at the forefront for the last 60 years talking about how communism is embedding itself in the American system. And by golly, they've been right. It's absolutely there. And anyone that ignores it is ignoring the truth. So with that said, Bill Jasper, are you on the call? And I'll let you start the discussion of the deep state, and then we'll have Mr. John McManus come on and talk about his feelings about much of what we're going to be talking about as well.
Well, thank you, Dan. It's a pleasure to be back with you. The deep state has become big news for over the last couple of years, particularly since the Trump inauguration. And when we talk about the deep state, that's a newer term for what we've been talking about at the New American Magazine and the John Birch Society for many years before the term deep state became common. We referred to those elements, those people, and those organizations within our government who are running things behind the scenes. That is, those people who stayed in office after administrations changed from Democrat to Republican, Republican to Democrat, and who actually called the shots and placed a lot of the people in the bureaucracy and in the cabinets. And we particularly focused on organizations like the Council on Foreign Relations, the Trilateral Commission, but there are a whole host of other organizations that have branched off from those two. And they have a very sinister and long-running influence in our government and control over it. And more recently, they've been called the deep state. That is, the state within the state who run the state behind the scenes. And today on the newamerican.com website, we have a story about that. And it says, Trump considers revoking security clearances for Brennan and others. And the Brennan that it's referring to there, of course, is John Brennan, the former head of the CIA. And the reason for that is John Brennan, who has been one of President Trump's most vicious attackers, has stepped out of his role at the CIA after being essentially fired by Trump, comes out, and he's been attacking Trump all the time. He accuses him of treason, accuses him of being an idiot, accuses him of all kinds of things. This is a very unprecedented role for a head of the CIA or any of our intelligence agencies, but it shows very, very clearly, I think, the nature of the deep state and its attack on the Trump administration, because we have all of these intelligence agencies that have been for the last, for decades now, increasingly becoming tools of the globalists, the one-worlders, who are really essentially the force of the deep state. They have become more and more tools for promoting globalism and dismantling national sovereignty and helping our enemies. Which is not to say, of course, that the thousands of people who operate in those agencies, in the FBI, the CIA, the NSA, etc., it is not to say that they are dishonorable or that they are not patriotic. Most of them are. And in fact, many of them have come out and opposed and denounced what these leaders are saying. But the leaders are politically appointed. And if you have the top political leadership of both parties corrupted and beholden to the deep state, to the globalists, they will place people in charge of those agencies that will advance the globalist cause, the one world cause, versus what they're supposed to be doing in protecting America. And so this morning, in our article, it's by Steve Bias, Trump considers revoking security clearance for Brennan and others. We're seeing this come to a head. Brennan, Comey, James Comey, former head of the FBI, James Clapper, former head of the National Intelligence, and a number of Michael Hayden, former CIA director, are all being considered now for having their security clearances removed. They're all out of. None of them are in office right now. They are all part of the news media end of the deep state. They've gone over to work to being commentators at CNN, at Newsweek, at NBC, and they are constantly holding forth there, attacking the president and the administration and its policies. And not only that, there's very strong reason, and the reason why Senator Rand Paul requested that the president remove their security clearances is that they continue to leak information. Now, anyone who, you or I, if we came upon information and we leaked it, it was classified information, we'd go to jail for it. We'd be prosecuted for it. They have admitted to leaking information. Most of these individuals, high-level top chiefs of these intelligence agencies, have admitted that they leaked information to reporters or to third parties who then leaked it to reporters, and always with the purpose of damaging the current administration. And so this is where we see the deep state attack on the president really comes very seriously to a point, because we've never before in our lifetimes or at any time in U.S. history seen anything like this, where top people in our branches of our government that are supposed to be protecting the people, protecting the president, protecting the Constitution, are using their positions to destroy the president. It's actually what is normally called a soft coup, or a soft coup attempt. They're not actually assassinating the president, but they're trying to take him down. And it's immoral, it's illegal, it's unconstitutional for these people to be doing what they're doing. And so this is a welcome thing. It's long overdue. They should have their security clearances removed. They shouldn't be allowed to continue having access to any of the materials or any of the agencies or agency personnel that they have had in the past. But this should be really a prelude to prosecution of them. And we can get into that as we go along here.
Mm-hmm. Well, one of the things I want to mention too, Jim, or Bill, I'm sorry, is the fact that John Brennan voted for Gus Hall, a communist, in I don't know, in the 1960s, right. And he also converted to Islam when he was over in Iraq, according to what I've read. So, there's some serious security issues here that stand out with John Brennan anyway, and it's kind of like Trevor Loudon's book, Enemies Within. There's so many of these people that are in these important positions, and certainly a number of them in our congressional seats, in our Senate and House offices, that could not pass any form of normal security clearance. And yet they're in charge of so much of what our government is doing. And that's one of the really bad parts about this whole thing, is the fact that so many of people who would be classified as enemies to the Constitution are actually in levels of government and in positions where they can influence decision-making at the very highest levels.
Yes, well,
John,
you mentioned...
go ahead. Sorry, go ahead.
You mentioned that he voted for Gus Hall. Most Americans today, that name doesn't ring a bell, but Gus Hall was the General Secretary, or Secretary General of the Communist Party USA. And when he ran for President of the United States a number of times, John Brennan voted for him. But then he lied about it. Now, he has admitted this in public, in the press. He said that when he went to join the CIA, and he had to take a polygraph, and so they were going to ask him. So they asked him in the polygraph if he had ever joined or supported any subversive groups that call for the overthrow of the government, and he says, "I panicked and I lied." So he not only showed that at least at one time, at an earlier time, that he supported the Communist Party of the United States and voted for its chief as president, but then he lied about it. And he not only lied about it, but he lied and passed a polygraph. So that tells us quite a bit about John Brennan, because he got caught lying multiple times after that, in fact, lying on national television. So we have a practiced habitual liar who worked for the enemies of the United States, the communists, at least in terms of voting for them. We don't know much more about that background. Concerning the charges that he converted to Islam, I've never seen actual proof of that. I've seen lots of references to that, and it's certainly plausible, but I don't know that for sure. And he did. It was interesting that when he took his oath of office, he did not take it on a Bible, which is traditional. And if he is a Muslim or a communist, the oath wouldn't mean anything to him anyway. But he wouldn't be using the Bible.
Hey, Bill, this is John McManus. Who appointed Brennan? Tell our listeners who appointed Brennan as head of the CIA.
You got me in a brain freeze right then. Tell us about it.
It was Obama.
Well, I thought it was, but I wasn't gonna. I was pretty sure that it was. I mean, Obama put him in there, and Obama, we've been told, is our first Muslim president. He says that he's not, and but Brennan has been one of the things that he did at CIA was to have sensitivity training on Islam and to put in sensitivity training for LBGT, all of the perversions. So Brennan has helped to destroy the CIA and any semblance of previous Americanism that was involved in it with those two programs alone.
You know, the subject of Islam having been brought up, it's worth reporting, or at least commenting on the fact that an awful lot of people have begun to realize that Islam is not so much a religion, but a political movement with the trappings of religion. Right from the very beginning of Mohammed's life and so forth, he made it pretty obvious that he was out to conquer politically, and he was using religion. I've frequently said that Hitler and Stalin made a mistake in not calling what they were doing a religion. Had they done so, they might have succeeded far more than they already did. But that's another point. But here we are with the deep state, and the deep state is being exposed, and that's wonderful. I'm delighted to know that there are many more people catching on to what is the deep state and how they conduct what they're trying to do, that lead everybody into a world controlled by them.
Right. Well, I guess, Bill, you have a recent article here called Dueling Investigations, and I'd like you to talk about how this Inspector General's report that came out gave pretty much a free pass to many of the people that are part of this. And why in the world does this continue to happen? I mean, they have got so many of the bases covered with their duplicity that it seems like there's just no end in sight to how much stuff they're going to try to cover up.
Well, Dan, when we look at what is really at stake and how long this has been in planning and design and implementation, when we consider the depth and breadth of what we call the deep state, we see that these organizations, the Council on Foreign Relations and their adjuncts, have been taking control over our government over the past century. And so they have a lot invested in this, and they have put people in place like John Brennan, and as we discussed last week, talking about Alger Hiss, you go back to Alger Hiss and the Rosenbergs and Victor Perlo and all of the spies and enemy agents that were in the Roosevelt administration during and after World War II. And we see that these were real enemies of the American people, all of Stalin's agents wanted. But they did not get in there just because Stalin put them in there. They got in there because they were being, their elevation and their places of power that they were put in the cabinet were being assisted and facilitated by the enemies within here in our own government, and those who were not necessarily communists, but were definitely globalists, one-worlders, members of the Council on Foreign Relations. And so, and every time the communists came under attack, whether by a congressional committee or by prosecution of the Justice Department, all of these top globalists in our government and in Wall Street and in other centers of power in the United States would come to bat for them and would defend them and would try to stop any prosecution. And that's what we see happening right now. We have all of these top-level people who've been kicked out of office by Trump, all of the top intelligence agencies, all of the well, not all of, but right from the very start when Trump came in, you know, the Justice Department is very, very critical to handling any kind of things in this matter. And so what did we have right from the very start? The acting Attorney General, Sally Yates, refused to implement Trump's plan, his travel ban, which the Supreme Court has upheld. And he had to fire her. Well, underneath her, there were still hundreds of DOJ employees who were part of the resistance that were Obama and Clinton supporters. Many of them had been in there for years. And so we see at a number of the agencies, at the EPA and in other agencies, they are simply doing everything they can to sabotage and thwart the current administration's plans. And at the Justice Department, this has been particularly critical. It was, and I don't know what kind of thought went into it by President Trump with the appointment, but he appointed, when Jeff Sessions recused himself, he appointed Rod Rosenstein to handle those things that Sessions had recused himself in. And that was a terrible appointment. I'm sure he regrets it now. But Rod Rosenstein has been working inside the Justice Department, along with Christopher Wray, who is now head of the FBI, to thwart all of the investigations that the House and the Senate are carrying out. And they are constitutionally empowered to do that, the House and the Senate, and their investigative committees. And so they are trying to pull out information on the various deep state actors who are carrying out this effort to unseat President Trump. And they're thwarted all along the way by these new appointees at the Justice Department, Rod Rosenstein and Christopher Wray at the FBI. So it shows how deep this goes. And when the Justice Department's Inspector General came out, Michael Horowitz, with his report on the email scandal of Hillary Clinton, this was very important because it showed that the FBI and the Justice Department were looking into Hillary Clinton's use of a email server and email accounts, which tens of thousands of classified documents were being transmitted over. This was against policy, and it's really against the law to jeopardize national security matters that way, unsecured telephone lines. So this was being investigated, and without going into all the details right here, we can examine some of them later, but just to refresh readers who might not have been keeping up with this, there's so much that's been happening. If you look at time after time, the FBI and the DOJ violated procedure by giving Hillary Clinton breaks every step of the way, allowing her to be interviewed or in the presence of other people who were going to be witnesses, Cheryl Mills and other people on her staff who should have been interviewed separately, allowing them to claim privilege that they wouldn't have allowed others to do, allowing the cell phones that had been broken up and whatnot, the guy who was in charge of that to be to make a plea agreement and not to prosecute him on that. So anyway, they were going through all these things on the what became known as the mid-year investigation of Hillary Clinton as the election was coming up, and they rushed through that, gave her a clean bill of health on that, gave her a little bit of a slap on the wrist, saying she was careless, and then moved on to the Trump investigation, the Trump-Russia collusion investigation, and the Michael Horowitz's Inspector General report has, it's over 500 pages long, and it has much information that's very damning concerning the FBI's actions in that regard, with regard to James Comey, Andrew McCabe, other top people in the FBI, of course Peter Strzok and Lisa Page, who the FBI lovers who were having an extramarital affair and were virulently anti-Trump, and who were top people in the investigation on Trump. They were obviously very biased, but typical of so many Inspector General reports that we've seen in the past. I reported on a number of them over the many years. They almost never come out with anything that is totally damning. They say, well, mistakes were made, things, we need to tighten up our operations here. We have to put new policies in place to make sure that abuses don't occur. And so in the end, Michael Horowitz said, yes, we found plenty of evidence of bias by Peter Strzok, Lisa Page, and others, but we did not find evidence that this bias affected the outcome of the investigation. And so this was when Peter Strzok was finally brought to, a week ago, to the forced to come in and testify before the House committees, two of the committees that were held joint hearings on it, all-day session. About half the time was taken up by Democrats who cited the Horowitz Inspector General report, and they would cite from it and say, well, the Inspector General's report says there was no evidence of bias, and they couldn't find anything there, so why are we even doing this? And this is part of the whole rat nest that we have to deal with the deep state. They have put so many people in there, and when it comes to having congressional hearings, then they have people who are designated obstructors who are going to try to take the investigation off course and make sure that they gum up the works as much as possible. And so we have the investigation still ongoing in the House and the Senate, and they have been producing a tremendous amount of information, but they are being stymied and stonewalled all along the way by Rod Rosenstein at Justice, by Christopher Wray at FBI, and of course Jeff Sessions, if he had not messed things up at the very beginning by recusing himself, he played right into the deep state hands, and the Democrats were calling on him to recuse himself, and he did. He shouldn't have, and so we've been dealing with this all along. That's why President Trump really lamented the fact several times in tweets that he appointed Jeff Sessions, because much of our problems now come from the fact that he is allowing the Justice Department, which he is the titular head over, he's allowing them to proceed with this, with obstructing Congress. And so we have the dueling investigations of both the House and the Senate, several committees investigating the deep state, and we have deep state actor Bob Mueller, former head of the FBI, former U.S. attorney, carrying out this whole witch hunt, as President Trump calls it, and I tend to agree with him. They have shown that thus far, that they have nothing. The Democrats, during the Peter Strzok investigation, kept pointing out that he's gotten 5, or I think it's 10 plea bargains and 5 convictions so far. They haven't gotten anything with regard to Russia collusion. They've been able to pressure people into pleading guilty by getting them in a false statement or an allegedly false statement that they made, and squeezing them, and that's what they are famous for doing. So there's a big. We're in the midst of this huge drama. We are seeing it play out right before our eyes, where we have those of the deep state who are trying to pull off their soft coup on President Trump so they can get back in power. And they have the Mueller investigation going. All the while they are trying to augment that with all of the attacks they can do in the media. And so we have Brennan and Michael Hayden and James Comey and Josh Campbell and Phil Mudd and all these people who are appearing regularly every night on CNN and NBC and CBS. So we have a multi-pronged attack by the deep state trying to unseat President Trump, while at the same time President Trump is doing what he can there, and the House and Senate investigations are trying to do the same thing.
Right.
To expose this.
Bill, we've got a break for a commercial break here, but we'll be back on the other side, and I'd like to get John in on the conversation to talk about how we can support the people.
Serving the planet. The Micro Effect. www.themicroeffect.com.
And we are, as a people, inherently and historically opposed to secret societies, to secret oaths, and to secret proceedings. For we are opposed around the world by a monolithic and ruthless conspiracy that relies primarily on covert means for expanding its sphere of influence.
It was 1776 when the founders signed the writ of independence from the Brits. It was revolution. Now an enemy from within would enslave us all again and deprive us of our rights in the Constitution. Restore the Republic. Wake up, it's time to understand.
Well, welcome back to Connecting the Dots with Dan Happel, and I'd like to start this discussion in the second half of the first hour with John McManus talking about how the appointment process that President Trump has been working on has been stalled in the Senate, and yet, the Republicans supposedly control the Senate. McConnell, and I know they haven't moved a lot of these people forward. This has been a process of appointment that's taken longer in modern history than any president. And I just, John, I'd like your input on that whole thing, because I know this is an area that really bothers you as well.
Well, it does. And of course, Supreme Court nominees or individuals that are appointed to the Supreme Court get a lifetime appointment, and it's a very important post. And for people to have a lifetime appointment to it without much scrutiny, other than people getting angry about this or that decision, it's extremely important that the right people get the post. I certainly salute what happened at the end of the Obama administration when he appointed a man for the vacant post, the post that was made available when Justice Scalia passed away, and they refused to hold hearings, and they refused right up until the time of the election, and then President Trump came in and so forth, and it was he who got the chance to nominate somebody, and he nominated a man named Gorsuch, and Gorsuch to date looks like what the American people should want as a Supreme Court justice. Now we have another vacancy, and you've got Mr. Kavanaugh, Judge Kavanaugh appointed. I've seen some pluses and I've seen some minuses about Kavanaugh. I had hoped that the appointment would have gone to somebody other than him, but nevertheless, he's now there. And the process for holding hearings, the Senate scrutiny and so forth before they vote on whether or not he's to be approved, that's in process, and we shall see what happens. I would expect that he'll be nominated. I expect that the Senate will approve him. There are a couple of Republicans who will not, but there are a couple of Democrats who probably will support him, and he will be, I think, the next Supreme Court justice. And then we get to judge the judge after he starts handing down decisions. So I don't know if that's what you wanted to, where you wanted to go, Dan, or not. If you have any questions.
Well, I know that a lot of the people that Trump has put forward in various cabinet level agencies as well. There are a lot of these appointments that huddled up in the Senate, and a lot of these things are really slow in happening. Now, I had an email from a friend of mine who's involved in a national security issue, and he had sent me a email here, and he said that a friend of his that is on the NSC said that there was a lady on there that was far to the left of him, and she is John Bolton's Putin expert. And they have got over 400 people in the National Security Council, and that was, because Obama stacked that thing with his people. There only need to be about 100 people in that NSC, and yet there's so many of these people in these various agencies that it's virtually impossible to get anything done. That's kind of where I'm coming at this from on that, John, and I'd like to see, maybe a little bit of your opinion on how we can possibly get some of these appointments through.
Well, we can get some of these appointments through by making sure that the people we vote into Congress are solid Americans. Got a great election coming up in 2018 here, the November election for Congress, and an opportunity to beef up the numbers of what I would consider to be really true Americans in the House and in the Senate. We will see what happens. But you mentioned John Bolton. I certainly approve the vote of the American people to put Donald Trump in the presidency rather than Hillary Clinton. But some of the appointments that Trump has made are unsettling, I guess you could say. One of them being John Bolton. John Bolton is a classic neoconservative. What is a neoconservative? A neoconservative is somebody who is essentially a socialist and a big government promoter who likes war. And John Bolton fits those descriptions very, very admirably. He fits it to a T. And he's a member of the Council on Foreign Relations. He's an insider. I've always considered him a member of the deep state. I was disappointed very, very gravely when I heard that President Trump had appointed him as the, well, I don't know exactly what the position is, but he's a foreign affairs expert for the president. So, you know, it's not all black and white, and you have to wonder who is feeding Donald Trump the names of people that he should pick for this post or for that post and so on.
Right.
Go right ahead.
No, you're absolutely right on the money with that, John. And one of the, I guess one of the most important things to try to follow is the fact that there are a number of people that Trump has been appointing that you kind of question the wisdom of why they're even there. And certainly the Council on Foreign Relations has always had such a huge influence on the appointment process. And so many of them end up in those powerful positions, and they aren't part of the solution. They're part of the problem.
Exactly. I remember a few years ago I put together a listing of the individuals beginning in the Eisenhower administration, no, even in the Truman administration, who were secretaries of state. And one after another, I think there were as many as 15 in a row, getting all the way up into more modern times, I guess we could say. All of them had been members of the Council on Foreign Relations, including John Foster Dulles, who was one of the founders, along with Edward Mandell House. So the Council on Foreign Relations is something that people ought to know about, and maybe we should spend some time just going over that.
Well, there's no question it's important, John, and I think that's something that very definitely we ought to at least talk about how it has influenced and I realize this is a fairly contemporary term, but how it's influenced the deep state, because so many of these people are globalists, and they are obviously part of the group that believes communism and socialism has a place in America.
Well, yes. In the previous hour, Alger Hiss was mentioned, but there are so many others. Dean Acheson was the founder of NATO in 1949 as the Secretary of State for President Harry Truman. NATO is now running the war in Afghanistan. 17 years after it started, we're still at it. We still are losing people over in Afghanistan. And the whole mess should have been cleaned up a long time ago. It was NATO that gave the go-ahead to enter into Afghanistan. So on and on we go, and we see that this whole Council on Foreign Relations tie-in with so many of these people is helps to explain why America doesn't win, why America loses, why we go to war without a declaration of war, why we're involved more and more in globalist activities, why we've become the policeman of the world for the United Nations, and so on. So the Council on Foreign Relations was begun when the United States Senate refused to enter the League of Nations, the precursor of the United Nations, way back in 1919. Anybody who knows enough of history would know that President Wilson wanted very much to have the League of Nations, which was to be the same thing that the United Nations has become. But the U.S. Senate said no. And when they did, there were a lot of good Americans who breathed a sigh of relief and said we shouldn't be involved in anything like that. So Edward Mandell House, the political manipulator from Texas who had befriended Wilson, he got together with a group of British confreres, and they formed organizations for their respective countries. British formed the Royal Institute for International Affairs. The Americans formed the Council on Foreign Relations. And the purpose of those organizations was to persuade the people of their countries to want world government. And that has been going on ever since. The Council on Foreign Relations started a magazine right away. One of its first issues talked about the need for world government, and so on, all the way up through the years. In the pre-war years, in World War II, the Council on Foreign Relations volunteered to send a bunch of people into the State Department, and President Roosevelt very happily said, yes, come right ahead. And these are the people who formed the war policies for the United States during World War II. One of the, you can get into a lot of criticism of the way we conducted ourselves in World War II, but one of the things that has always struck me is the D-Day landings and the tremendous loss of life going into armed German soldiers who had positions, and they were just slaughtering the people who went away. There were others who said that the attack on Germany should have started up through the Balkans, which were not heavily defended, and could have drawn a lot of troops away from France and so on. So who were making these decisions? Well, Council on Foreign Relations members were making those decisions, even during World War II. And then there was the bombing of the Japanese citizenry with atomic weapons when the Japanese had been trying to surrender for more than a year, and there never would have been an Iwo Jima or an Okinawa or a battle or a lot of other things, and there certainly wouldn't have been dropping the atomic bomb on defenseless Japanese citizens. The reason the bomb was dropped was to promote the idea of the need for a world government. That was a direct outcome of the dropping of the bombs on Japan. And so on we go. We see the Council on Foreign Relations, and it's very important people in very top positions in the Roosevelt administration and the Truman administration and the Eisenhower administration and every administration since, all the way up until our own times. Now, there have been fewer of them in the Trump administration, but there still are some. And we've got to be aware of that. We've got to be aware that anybody who is a member of the Council on Foreign Relations should be suspect. You can imagine if Donald Trump had appointed somebody from the John Birch Society, there would have been, all kinds of screaming and yelling and so forth, which shouldn't have happened because John Birch Society people are pro-American and patriotic. But you get members of the Council on Foreign Relations appointed to positions here and there, and there isn't at all any screaming about that, and there should be. So
And we, if I could hop right in here, we see that in spades right now in the attacks on Donald Trump. The Council on Foreign Relations dominates all of the fake news media. Members of the Council on Foreign Relations are on the editorial boards. They're top reporters, columnists. And so recently, for instance, Max Boot, who is a fellow in residence, a senior fellow at the Council on Foreign Relations. He's been, that's who pays his bill. But he also writes for the Washington Post, for CNN, for a number of other publications. And he is incessantly attacking President Trump, amplifying the calls, saying it's now time to call treason what it is. He just had a column last week on that, promoting the idea. So here is a top member of the Council on Foreign Relations, and there are dozens more, hundreds more. There are over 4,000 members of the Council on Foreign Relations. They're one of their biggest fields that they have their membership operating in is media, journalism. And so that is how we see the orchestration of the attacks, not just on President Trump, but all across the board whenever conservatives are being attacked or an American institution is being attacked. You can see the coordination that goes on between the media. A lot of people say it's just a herd mentality. All these liberals thinking alike. Well, that's part of it, but no, there is actual orchestration and direction behind all of this. And we see this particularly right now with all of the attacks on anyone of significance who is standing up against the deep state and assisting Trump. For instance, Congressman Jim Jordan, he's come under attack now. They sent some sleuths around, and they found that 30 years ago, 20 or 30, 40 years ago, when he was a coach, an assistant coach, some wrestling coach, some students are saying that they were molested by the team medical doctor, and Jim Jordan didn't do anything about it. Now, they're not saying that he molested them or anything, but they're saying that he didn't do anything about it. Well, he claims he didn't know anything. He was an assistant coach. He didn't know anything about it, never heard anything about it at all. So it's really a non-story, but it has been played up. The same thing with the attacks on Congressman Devin Nunes, who has been heading the investigation for the Intelligence Committee. They've been after him from day one, as soon as Trump went into the White House. So anybody who stands up and defends what's right is going to come under attack. And when we see all of the different CFR media apparatuses going into full attack mode, we know that, okay, we've seen this before. We know what this is all about. Likewise, when a hard left or outright communist is about to be exposed, you can expect that all of them are going to rush to defend the leftist and or divert attention with some other kind of trumped-up expose.
Mm-hmm. Well, Bill, you know, one of the, and we're going to have a break here shortly, but one of the things I want to talk about is why Americans, good Americans, have fallen for this trap, and how this whole idea was sold to the American people that somehow these people are the ones that we ought to be following instead of the people who defend our Constitution. We'll pick that up on the other side of the break.
www.themicroeffect.com.
You take the blue pill. The story ends. You wake up in your bed and believe whatever you want to believe. You take the red pill. You stay in Wonderland. And I show you how deep the rabbit hole goes.
There was a mighty nation, blessed above all of creation. It was a rare and precious pearl, conceived in faith and liberty, home of the brave, land of the free. It was the envy of the world. But this shining city on a hill has turned from the Creator's will and let evil take control. Now the reckless men who lead them want to strip away their freedom and to steal their very soul. Now it's smoke and mirrors, switching bait, criticize and confiscate and let the guilty walk away. In this once righteous, godly nation, in the halls of education, they forbid a child to pray. They say we need to spread the wealth. They pretend to guard the health of the feeble and the poor, while the hand they hold behind their back confuses and conceals the fact that the wolf is at the door. There's an unseen hand that
Well, welcome to Connecting the Dots with Dan Happel. And today we really have a special show, and it's because we are talking the deep state. Before we continue with this discussion, though, I want to remind our listeners how important it is to support this radio network. We are the voice of freedom, and radio networks like the Micro Effect and others around the country are literally the last bastions of freedom. The mainstream media, or as we like to refer to them, the lamestream media, are controlled by people who are trying to destroy this country, and the truth has to have an outlet. So it's important, please really support these individual, independent radio networks like the Micro Effect. Get on, support their sponsors, donate money. It's important that you really do what you need to do to make sure this network stays alive. And I also want to remind our listeners that Boss Galuppi's Radioactive Wednesday is tomorrow. It is from 8 a.m. to 10 a.m. Pacific time, and she does the same kind of broadcast that I do. In fact, a lot of the time we coordinate with one another to make sure that our radio broadcasts are supportive of one another so that we can help people to connect the dots. Also, I want to remind people that Jeff Bennett's Life, Liberty, and All That Jazz is on immediately after our shows, and that's an excellent program as well. So with that, I want to start the second hour of this program with the statement, and it's been attributed to John Adams, but I don't know exactly who said this, but it's been attributed to John Adams, and that is, those who fail to participate in representative government are bound to be led by their inferiors. And boy, if that isn't the case anymore, it's amazing the quality of people who end up in politics, and even the ones that start out in relatively solid constitutional order end up being, I don't know what, but they sell their souls to the devil, and it just amazes me, some of the people, how bad they become after they've been in office for a while. So, John, I'd like to talk again about why the American people have been sold on this program, on all this internationalism, this globalism, but primarily on socialism and communism. How in the world did our American people swallow this bitter pill?
mostly because they went to the government schools. You can get an idea of how intense and how all-consuming the attack on the American system is by knowing that everybody in America is supposed to believe that we were a democracy and that we've never been anything else but a democracy. And yet there was nothing our founding fathers feared more than democracy. You won't find the word in the Constitution. You won't find it in the Declaration of Independence. You won't find it in the constitutions of any of the 50 states. The word democracy does not appear. What did they give us instead? They gave us a republic. And the difference is very easy to explain. That democracy is ruled by the people without any restrictions. If you can con the people into wanting this or that or something else, then democracy will say, okay, you've got to give it to them. You've got to have it. You've got to arrange to meet their demands. Or if you have a republic, you have a rule of law. And the law is the Constitution of the United States. Now, if the Constitution were fully enforced as it is today, as it is written, then the government would be 20% its size and 20% its cost. There would be no Department of Education, no Department of Energy, no Department of this and that and so many others that have sprung up over the years to control American people and to lead us into a world government. So, unfortunately, the schools in America are not teaching what our founding fathers gave us. They're not teaching about the Constitution or the Declaration of Independence and so forth. You know, it's amazing to me to find a response from an ordinary American when I mention to him that the Declaration of Independence states very clearly that men are endowed by their Creator with certain unalienable rights. We didn't get them from government. We didn't get them from thin air. We got them from God Almighty. And then I say, and you know, you can't teach that in the government schools today. You can't teach that fundamental premise of the Declaration of Independence in the schools that we're all forced to pay for. So what do they teach instead? Well, they teach all kinds of baloney. They teach all kinds of error and misstatements and so on and so on. And that's why we're in the fix that we're in today. The American people haven't been taught the wonders of the American system that they were given. And they didn't have to earn it. It was already just laid on a platter for them. And if you don't earn something, sometimes you don't understand its value. And that's what's happened in America.
No, I think you're right on the money with that, John. And you know, one of the things that we've seen in education, and Charlotte Iserby, a friend of mine who keeps me posted on what's going on in the classrooms, but there have been a number of initiatives where we are in agreements with the Soviets, with the Russians, and with the Chinese on coordinating education programs. If there was ever a place where we wouldn't want to be coordinating, it's with communists.
Well, it's being done through the United Nations, the United Nations UNESCO program. Bill Jasper is much more of an expert on that than I am, but I know enough about it to know that it in itself is one of the biggest reasons why we should get out of the United Nations and tell them, okay, we're going to go on as an independent country, not tied to the United Nations and to UNESCO and to all of its other sub-agencies. Bill, where are you on that subject?
Well, that's one of the other things that I would applaud President Trump on. We haven't completely gotten out of UNESCO, but he at least started it in motion. And you know, that we saw that once before under President Reagan, where we withdrew from UNESCO and withdrew our funding, but we never withdrew our membership in the United Nations or the hundreds of other United Nations agencies and sub-agencies. And so time went on, and pretty soon we were back in it again. And so really, in order to permanently cut off UNESCO, and UNESCO, the United Nations Education, Scientific, Cultural Organization, which is one of the agencies that even people that don't like the UN kind of think, well, UNICEF and UNESCO, they're doing good things. They're helping children. They're helping people around the world. So we should support that. No, those are two of the most insidious branches of the United Nations. They constantly are using the old ploy, it's for the children, and they will show these heartrending pictures of children around the world. Then they will show some UNESCO, UNICEF people helping put up a classroom or handing out aid to families and children. And that's part of the whole propaganda that the insiders, the deep state, the globalists are promoting, that we have to look to the United Nations and its various globalist adjuncts to solve every problem in the world. But as we discussed last time we were on, and just so I don't want to go back over plowing the same area, the United Nations has been an enemy institution in our midst from the very beginning, and all of its agencies likewise. And they will put on a front of doing a few good things, just like Al Capone had his soup kitchens. That was part of his propaganda, to burnish his image. And meanwhile, his thugs were going out and terrorizing not just Chicago, but the whole region. So we need to get out of UNESCO fully. And I don't know where that stands right now in the Trump administration. He initiated it. But we have mentioned the resistance within his own administration, in the State Department, in the Education Department, whatnot. And here's where I don't think we've mentioned it yet in this particular broadcast, but I highly recommend, and I want to promote the New Americans special issue on the deep state. And our correspondent, Alex Newman, pretty much single-handedly did the whole issue. And part of the one of the articles that he does on the deep state is about the deep state bureaucracy. And that's where you see in all the different agencies the holdovers that are still there, that are sabotaging from within, leaking information, stopping programs that the president has tried to implement. They don't want to see the swamp drained. They're swamp creatures, and they know that is their life's blood. And so they want to keep the swamp festered, and they want to see it filled. And so one of his articles, Bureaucracy versus Trump, America and the Constitution, Alex points out that in a study done by The Hill, which is a publication that comes out from Washington, D.C., it's about The Hill, meaning the Congress, they had one of their investigation reports showed that 97%, or maybe it was 98%, of all the money that went into the congressional or to the presidential campaign in 2016 went to Hillary Clinton from all of the federal bureaucracy. That is all of the different agencies. So you can see almost 100% of the bureaucracy was for Clinton. Most of those people are still in there. There are thousands of Obamaites, Clintonites in the Department of State, Department of Education. Department of State was one of the worst of the departments. And, of course, they're the ones that determine all of the foreign policy, all of the our relations with other countries, and much more. They were one of the worst, but Alex has a breakdown there of all the monies that went to Clinton, from those who work in the State Department, those who work in the Education Department. The Education Department, 99.7% of donations of Education Department employees went to Clinton. I mean, it's all, virtually 100% went to Clinton, and those people were against Trump. So it was not surprising that when Betsy DeVos was appointed as Secretary of Education, she found some of her most virulent opposition came from her own employees, and that's the way it has gone in all of the different departments. And so when President Trump or someone in his administration announces a policy, they not only have to overcome the fake news media, which is going to be opposed to it, they not only have to overcome the opposition from Chuck Schumer and Nancy Pelosi and the Democrats in Congress, and the never-Trumpers within the Republican Party, the John McCains, the Jeff Flakes, the Lindsey Grahams, but they have to overcome all of those residual Clintonites, Obamaites that are in the massive federal bureaucracy. And so until the president succeeds in weeding out a lot more of those people, so that the resistance within and the sabotage within his own administration and the leaks, the damaging leaks that keep flowing out, it's going to be a real tough road. And so we have to recognize that this is a very very hot war that's going on there, and that we need to be encouraging our members of Congress to fight it and not to cave in, not to go along with the McConnell-Ryan leadership, which has been helping to sabotage the Trump administration.
No, you're right, Bill. And that's a real tough thing for someone like President Trump to try to deal with a political system that is so heavily stacked against him, and even his own people, or people supposedly on his side, are part of the opposition. That's a tough thing for anyone to deal with, and I want to discuss how so many of the governmental organizations and all these groups, you were talking about the government employees, how they put money into the Clinton coffers, and certainly not into the Trump coffers. But John, you had mentioned the fact that Obama had not tried to fill that Supreme Court position, that he allowed it to stay open, but I don't think that would have been the case had he realized that the Clinton presidency was not an assured thing. I think he was doing that as a courtesy to her, to allow her to do one of the appointments to the Supreme Court, and he thought it was a slam dunk. And so we've got to put our efforts into whatever we need to do to expose just exactly what level the deep state is, and it's programs like these are obviously part of that. So, John, would you talk? I'd like your input on what we can do to really help this president to expose a lot of these things.
Well, we go back to the basics. We go back. I think an explanation of the difference between a democracy and a republic is the way to get a decent American's attention, and the fact that he would immediately recognize there's something wrong with everybody saying democracy, 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 when the founding fathers of our country were very adamant about not having a democracy. In fact, they feared it and they condemned it. So how do we get started? Well, obviously, those who are aware of what the deep state is all about, and those who are concerned about the future for themselves and for their children and grandchildren and so on, they've got to take it upon themselves to be a missionary. They've got to begin to realize that they have to approach the next guy and the next guy and the people that they meet with and deal with and so forth. I've had amazing, wonderful success in just chatting with the people at the post office. I find that there are amongst them people who are desperately looking for answers to what's going on. And I think this could be anywhere. I found the same thing in a barber shop. And I find it in guys who work to service the automobile that I have. So, well, get yourself trained, get yourself aware of some interesting facts that you could present to somebody, and have them look at you and say, "How come nobody ever said that to me before?" I said, "Well, what else would you like to hear about? You want to hear about the United Nations? You want to hear about the civil rights movement that almost tore this country in two? Do you want to hear about something else or something else?" There's all kinds of information that people should have, not necessarily at their fingertips, but at least an entree to those areas at their fingertips. If the many people who are listening to this show and to other shows like it, and happily there are many of them, begin to realize that it's a responsibility that each of us has to reach out and to touch other people and to get them involved in understanding and then maybe becoming a crusader for the cause. So,
no, I think you're spot on with that, and obviously there's an old adage: you can't win the game unless you're in the game, and so many of our folks in this country have decided to be spectators and not be participants in the game. And the reality is you can't win being a spectator. All you can do is cheer one side or the other, and eventually you'll lose the game.
Well, yeah, and let me give you an example of somebody who triumphed over the attack and so forth. If a good American gets appointed to a position, a Supreme Court judge or a cabinet position or something like that, if he's a really good American, he will be attacked. There's absolutely no doubt about that. But a good example of somebody who withstood the attack and has helped in many ways to make America get back to where it should be is Supreme Court Justice Clarence Thomas. Now, Clarence Thomas was being investigated. I think he was put up to be defeated, and the defeat of Clarence Thomas was going to be arranged by somebody accusing him of sexual misconduct and so on and so on. You may recall some of that, you may not, but that's what happened to Clarence Thomas. So he didn't just wilt and fade away. He fought back, and he demanded honesty and justification. Happily, he had a couple of senators who were friends of his who knew him well enough to know that charges that were being made against him were false. He stood up to them. He became a member of the Supreme Court, and he is probably the best of all of the judges on the Supreme Court, in my view. He's not flamboyant, but he's solid. He understands, and so forth. So you can win if you stand up. The day may come when you can't win at all because you won't be given a chance to win. So we have to guard against that. So I don't think anybody should be ashamed of the fact that they want to stand up and they want to take the slings and the arrows of the enemy and so forth. Another good example of somebody who was faced with all kinds of attack was Robert Welsh, the man who founded the John Birch Society. He stood up to them. He didn't wilt, and he gathered a tremendous following, and the rest rest is history. I've just finished a book that I've finished called The History of the John Birch Society. It'll be available in mid-August, and anybody who is listening, you can get it after mid-August. Just go to Shop JBS on the internet, and there you are. You'll see my book to tell what really happened in all those early years in the John Birch Society, and how it survived, and how it continued, and how it's still operating, and how we mean to put our country back on track. Not to take power, just to put the country back on track.
Uh-huh. Well, and your point about Clarence Thomas, I remember the testimony by Anita Hill. That was she was supposedly going to expose his sexual misconduct, but it kind of backfired in their face. And really what it boils down to is that just average Americans have got to have a mission to stay in the game and not allow these people to control the dialogue. And that's been the issue all along. I've got a good friend who talks about that a lot, but we end up on their battleground and we play by their rules. And we need to change the dynamic of the rules that we play by to be rules that work better for the kind of battle that we're ready to bring forward. So that's an important aside with that as well. So, Bill, do you have something that you would recommend to our listeners as well on ways to get involved and to make a difference?
Well, yes, it might seem self-serving, but of course, first what I would say is if they're not already doing so, they should subscribe to the New American magazine. And in addition to that, or if they're not ready to do that, they should make the New American their home page and visit us often. We have news and information there that you're not going to get anywhere else. I mean, when it comes to analyzing particularly the deep state and sorting out the facts from fiction, there have been an explosion of websites in the last 10 years which deal with all kinds of news, behind the news, secret stuff. I can just tell you, we vet our news very carefully. We're not trying to rush out and get the story first and foremost. We want to make sure that it's accurate, and so we even sacrifice many times, just about every day, a story being the first on the block with the story, because we want to make sure that it's true. There is a lot of false information, a lot of it being dangled by the deep state to take people off track and to discredit conservatives. And so, if you want very carefully researched and reliable news, go to thenewamerican.com. And again, I'd like to reiterate, get your copy of The Deep State, which is, in my opinion, it's by Alex Newman, our special issue of the New American on Deep State. Because first, before we take action, we have to be informed. We have to educate ourselves before we activate ourselves. Otherwise, we're going to be fools out there. So first, we have to do our homework. The battle, the stakes in the battles that we're in are so high that we all have to be willing to first inform ourselves, and then we have to get activated. And with regard to the deep state, you have a couple of different options on that issue. The magazine, you can get a hard copy. You can order a hard copy online, or you can order a digital copy, a PDF copy of it, so you'll get it immediately. So inform yourselves. The New American Magazine, you can contact your local chapters of the John Birch Society, or if you don't know where there is one, go to jbs.org, and you can become a member, find out where you have a local chapter. The JBS is active all over the country, not in big splashy ways. We're doing the hard work at the ground level of educating and activating others. And one of the ways that you can be activated, even if you're a busy schedule, if you're a working mom or an at-home mom with the kids, homeschooling.
Bill, I hate to interrupt you here, but we are moving into a commercial break, and we'll pick that up on the other side.
All right.
Serving the planet. The Micro Effect. www.themicroeffect.com.
And we are, as a people, inherently and historically opposed to secret societies, to secret oaths, and to secret proceedings. For we are opposed around the world by a monolithic and ruthless conspiracy that relies primarily on covert means for expanding its sphere of influence.
It was 1776 when the founders signed the writ of independence from the Brits. It was revolution. Now an enemy from within would enslave us all again and deprive us of our rights in the Constitution. Restore the Republic. Wake up, it's time to understand. Restore the Republic. We're losing our freedom in the land. Working from behind the scenes, controlling everything, from the daily news we read to the politicians. And they're pulling our financial strings.
Well, welcome back to Connecting the Dots with Dan Happel, and we've got a terrific show today. We are talking with William Jasper, the senior editor for the New American Magazine, and we are talking with Manis, who was president of the John Birch Society for many years, and both are accomplished authors. Both are very, very tuned in on exactly what has been happening with our country, with the deep state. And Bill, you were talking about how important it is for people to subscribe to the New American, and I couldn't agree more. There are two magazines that I literally read cover to cover every time I get one, and one is the New American, and the other is Range Magazine. And between those two magazines, you can learn an awful lot of what's happening in the real world and not in the phony world of the false media.
Well, thank you. Yes, and so if people want to subscribe to the New American, we publish a print issue. We're one of the few magazines that still exists in the real hard copy print world. Most of the others along the way, U.S. News and World Report, Newsweek, etc., have bit the dust, but we're still publishing. And we then have our website, which publishes a great deal more in terms of articles. There are advantages to each, the print and the virtual magazine. And so, but we publish every day 10, 12, 15 new exclusive articles, including commentary from my colleague John Manis, who is on here, who was our publisher for many years. So I would encourage people to go there. Every article that you see there that you can post on Facebook or any of the social media really helps us. Now, I'm not a big fan of Facebook. We've written lots of articles exposing Facebook and Zuckerberg and Google and all these things. But while they do exist, if you do use those platforms, please use them to put our information out there. We have to expand the alternative media universe to offset the fake news media that still dominates the broadcast and cable news. But beyond that, there are many things that people can do. As I was in the midst of saying, even if you're in a busy schedule, if you're a homeschooling mom or a stay-at-home mom, or you're working in the workforce mom, or a businessman, or a dad who's busy with working 2 or 3 jobs, there's still things you can do, particularly as a netizen online. All of the alternative media, ourselves included, are under attack by trolls all the time, who are, whenever we post an article, you have all these trolls that come on that will try to debunk and defame the author and the facts in the case, etc. We can do the same thing by promoting online the good things. And when we see stories in our local media, most of our local media are online as well, we don't have to sit down and compose a big letter to the editor, but when we see something that is wrong that they're promoting, we can go on as netizens, go online, make a comment, and refer them to an article in the New American and put the link in there. Most of the media allow that, and it's a way to really expand our information network out there and to get to educate your fellow citizens. As Jack was saying, we all run into people every day, and there are opportunities for us to speak to a neighbor, a mailman, the pastor of your church, other people at church, other people in the local community at the store. I have that happen to me pretty regularly, where people will say something, and I just use it to say, to mention Trump or Hillary or Obama or something, and then you gauge from that, and pretty soon they're asking some more questions. So we have to realize that we are in a war, and the other side has been winning, because when you have a war going on and only one side's fighting, they're going to win. Our side hasn't been fighting, or there haven't been enough of us fighting. So we need to get first educated, then activated, and here's another thing that everyone can do. I happen to be a Christian. I believe in the power of prayer. Every American who believes in the power of prayer should be praying every day, praying for help for those who are fighting the good fight here in our country, praying for help in exposing the evil ones who are trying to subvert our country and take away our freedoms, subvert our families. That is something that we all can and should be doing.
Now, you're right. We're a Christian nation, and we should be acting like a Christian nation, and certainly the power of prayer. I think, frankly, that President Trump wouldn't have been elected had it not been for divine intervention. I know the American people had a lot to do with it, but I think there was a lot more to it than that. I think being given a last. I've got a gentleman by the name of Chuck Floyd, who is a national security expert, and Chuck was going to call in on our third line and wanted to be part of the conversation so that he could maybe talk a little bit about his experience in dealing with the deep state. Chuck, are you on the call? No, it doesn't sound like he made it on the call. He's been involved with the border security issue, and he's also been involved with the actual security architecture for the State Department. He's been one of the leaders in that whole movement for the last 15 years. And I was hoping that he could join us because he's got very explicit examples of some of the things that have been happening, being promoted by the deep state. Chuck, if you get on the call, just interrupt and we will allow you to talk a little bit about some of the things that you've been seeing in Washington, D.C., where you've been one of the people trying to help drain the swamp. Okay, John, I want to you talk about the Council on Foreign Relations. We talk about the big foundations and all the money and all the power that's been concentrated to really fight us and destroy the Republic, destroy the idea that is America. How can we expose these foundations and these non-governmental organizations that have been so deeply involved in that? Is there a way to expose the money and the power that they're influencing our whole political process with?
Well, yeah, the way to do it is to know and to speak the truth, and that's what the John Birch Society is all about. What we want is to arm a lot more Americans with the truth, and then tell them, okay, you go out and spread the truth, counter the falsehoods, counter the terrible things that are being done, and of course, what we also want is for people to eventually elect to the Congress, the House and the Senate, people who are true Americans, who understand what America is all about. You know, I have a short summary of exactly what ought to be known by Americans. And it's very simple. It says, America became great not because of what government did, but because of what government was prevented from doing by the Constitution. You say that to some people, and they'll shake their head and they'll say, how come nobody else ever says that? That's true. Anybody who has an understanding of what the Constitution is all about, the rule of law rather than the rule of a mob, you have to have a rule of law, and the rule of law for America is the Constitution. So if the Constitution were fully enforced, the government would be 20% its size and 20% its cost. And you know, Dan, I had an interesting experience. I was up in your state of Montana there, maybe 5-6 years ago. I've been there many times, but this was one of my more recent times. And I made that statement in the speech that I was giving, the statement that America became great not because of what government did, but because of what government was prevented from doing. And, of course, that if the Constitution were fully enforced, the government would be 20% its size and 20% its cost. Well, after I finished, a fella came up with, and he still had his work clothes on. He'd just come in out of the fields of his ranch, I guess. And he looked at me with kind of a scowl, and he said, "You said 20%. How about 5?" And I quickly responded, "You may be right. Okay, from now on, I'll be more careful about that. And maybe I'll throw in the number 5 in addition to the number 20." He could be right. You know, if the Constitution were fully enforced, the federal government might be 5% of the size that it is, 5% of the cost, 5% of the influence, and so forth. Not that we wouldn't have a government, but we would have a limited government. We would have a government under the law, the Constitution. And that's what a republic is all about. So I would recommend to your listeners that they get an understanding of what is the difference between a republic and a democracy. You can do that by getting a hold of the Shop JBS on the JBS website and ask for a copy of Robert Welch's magnificent speech in 1961, Republics and Democracies. Get a copy of a DVD that I've done called An Overview of Our World, which explains very simply the difference between a republic and a democracy and why our founding fathers gave us a republic. That in itself would start people towards wanting to say, well, am I being misled in other areas? I'm being misled about the fact that we're a republic, not a democracy. What else am I being misled about? And you've got an opening there to start getting people to understand, getting them to subscribe to the New American Magazine, getting them to join the John Birch Society. We need more members in the Birch Society. We know that, and we're anxious all the time to reach out and get more of them. So
No, you're right on that. And the thing that I think Bill alluded to earlier, you have too, is that education is the area where we've really fallen short because we've allowed the other side to control our education of our youth. And frankly, what they're being taught in schools today has nothing to do with what our original intent of our founding fathers was. And if we had any idea of how many things have been changed in this nation, where we have no real, let's say, foundation left, or in the actual agencies, in our actual government, they've changed so much that we have to go back to the original founding documents. No question about it.
Right, and if we go back to the time when our country was formed, we'll find that the people who formed the country, Madison and Hamilton and everybody, all the founding fathers, Washington included, they never went to school.
Right.
They were educated at home. They were educated at a local church. They were at the father's knee or the mother's knee, and so on. There was no government education, no public school system in our country for the first 90 years of the existence of our country. It started in the middle of the 1800s, and it grew to what it is today, and it's an absolute abomination.
Mm-hmm. Well, and you're right. The original concept was what was called classical liberal education. And liberal had a totally different meaning. The idea with classical liberal education was that they learned all the Romance. They learned Latin. They learned poetry. They learned all kinds of history from literally from the Roman Empire and before. They learned what the whole system was all about. They learned mathematics. They learned things in a way that the sociologists have totally changed the meaning of education. Now it's redistribution, but under classical education, it was learning how to really learn to be a critical thinker and to grow with understanding, and the whole system was designed to make people readers and learners and listeners, and not allow themselves to be led around by their nose.
I had an experience some years ago with a bunch of college-educated individuals who a friend got together to listen to a guy from the John Birch Society and find out what this is really all about. So we got together. I decided that one of the things that we could do would be to start to read the Federalist Papers. These were the essays put together by Madison, Hamilton, and Jay to explain the Constitution to the farmers in New York State so that they would want the Constitution, so that they would allow it to be ratified by their state. So we got together, and I got everybody a copy of the Federalist Papers, and I said, okay, next time we meet, I want everybody to read essays number 1 or number 7. I've forgotten which numbers I asked them. So we got together a week later, and I said, okay, how are we doing with the Federalist Papers? And one after another, they said, well, it was a little bit difficult reading. I said, but it was written for the farmers in New York State in 1789. These were all college graduates. And they all said, well, it was too difficult to read and to grasp and so forth. Can we start somewhere else? So I kind of said, okay, we'll start somewhere else. But it never really lasted much longer than that. These guys, they wanted instant solutions. They wanted instant something. They didn't want to learn. They didn't want to study. They didn't want to get the historical perspective and how our country's being destroyed. And that's typical. You read the Federalist paper, sometimes one sentence is the entire page. And you know, it's done in classical English language, and it's good, solid information. You understand why the Constitution was put together and what it says and what it really means and so on. But these men, they couldn't understand it. It was too tough for them, and they were college men.
Yeah, you're right. The whole idea of a classical education was to get people to think independently, think for themselves, become, let's say, able to reason deductively, to be able to look at facts and then come to a conclusion based on a background of classical knowledge. And
well, Dan, you're probably aware of the fact that we've started a homeschool program. Freedom Project Academy is an outgrowth of the Birch Society, located in Appleton, Wisconsin, same place where our headquarters is. And they are putting out homeschool effort via the internet. And it's already very successful. And we encourage anybody who is upset about what they see their children being exposed to in the government schools, and might want to withdraw them from it and get involved in a homeschool program. Check out Freedom Project Academy of the John Birch Society in Appleton, Wisconsin. So,
and we have had Duke Pest has been on the radio show, and also Alex Newman is a particularly good friend. Alex is an absolutely amazing young man, and
I agree.
They have both been on talking about how important this homeschooling education is.
Right. Yeah, we're very happy that it's got Duke Pester is running it. He's a PhD and a college professor, and a guy who's really on fire for the right use of people's time who want to have their youngsters educated. And we get the parents sometimes, quite frequently, the parents of the students are saying how much they're learning when this through the FPA, the Freedom Project education courses that their children are taking. So Dan, it's been great to be with you for another 2 hours. I salute what you're trying to do, and I know you salute what we're trying to do with Bill Jasper and the New American, and with me and what I've done in the John Birch Society over 50 years and so on. So thanks for the chance to speak to your audience, and maybe sometime we can do it again.
Well, I thank you for that. And Bill, thank you. I appreciate you being our guest today. And you're an Idaho resident now, so you appreciate the micro effect, the radio network's right next door.
Absolutely.
All right. Well, thank you, gentlemen, and I look forward to the next time we have you on the show.
Thank you.
Hello.
And deprive us of our rights in the Constitution. Restore the Republic. Wake up, it's time to understand. Restore the